So about 3 months ago, I made a bold prediction. I predicted that one of the biggest and permanent transformations was happening to the Middle East's balance of power in decades, in that the prevailing rivalry between Sunnis and Shias, demonstrated through the competition of the Saudis and Iranians over regional hegemony, was being replaced by something far bigger and involving far many more actors. Quietly, incrementally, driven by the chaos of October 7th, Israel's subsequent response, the chaos of the Iran war, and the growing realization across many nation states that American security guarantees were no longer reliable. And then on Friday in Mecca, that force was signed into name. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, NATO's second largest military, the world's top oil exporter, and the only Muslim majority nuclear power, signed the Mecca Joint Defense Pact. An attack on one is an attack on all. Three of the largest Muslim majority populations on Earth, with complementary military, financial, and industrial capabilities, now formally bound together in this collective security and deterrence agreement. So I want to tell you the story here of what this actually means, not what the press releases are saying, what it actually does for the Middle East, for America, for Israel, for Iran, and the overall balance of power to not just the Middle East, but potentially far beyond that in a way that so many people have not yet understood. This is the Global Gambit. How you going, everyone? Welcome to the channel. Now, I actually covered the beginnings of this defense pact, this collective security arrangement, back in November when the Saudis and Pakistanis first signed a strategic partnership. You can find that video in the description, and I encourage you to watch it for historical context. But the point is that even if the war in Iran hadn't occurred, the potential for this agreement was always there. And certainly it's taken the events of Trump and Israel to lead to this now. But what do you think? Is this something that will change the balance of power, or is it largely symbolic? How likely are the three countries actually to follow through on their commitments? Let me know in the comments below. So first, we have to understand why this has happened. Now, this agreement didn't come out of nowhere, as I just stated. It came from a specific causal chain of independent events that have all compressed together and over years from gradual drift into a single decisive moment. Firstly, take Israel. Israel under Netanyahu and his ultra-nationalist government, and of course ever since October 7th, has not been interested in the kind of regional normalization that the Abraham Accords established by Trump in 2020 had promised. Israel was interested in military dominance, be that in Gaza, in Lebanon, in strikes on Iranian proxies across the region, in the attacks that it's done in places like Doha of late last year. Essentially, though, every Sunni majority government in the Middle East was drawing the same conclusion. That Israel's behavior under this government, at least, had become unpredictable and essentially expansionist, without being a potential effective direct threat to them. Conversely, Iran remained a very parallel threat, its plausible deniability and the ability to project power a lot further than people thought. Saudi Arabia had been struck repeatedly by Iran over many years in what's known as a shadow war, and then, of course, even more so since the outbreak of the US-Israeli war in February of this year. Saudi Arabia hosts American military bases and therefore makes it a target. Many of the Gulf states do. But crucially for Saudi Arabia, it doesn't have a formal mutual defense agreement with Washington, the petrodollar agreement underpinning much of not just the Middle East, but the global economy. And then, of course, there is Trump and America, who have prioritized Israel above all other regional relationships, telling allies that they need to effectively fend for themselves, and showing no sign of filling that gap. Countries across the region arrived at the same question simultaneously then. What do we do if America isn't there? And this Mecca Joint Defense Pact is the answer. Not necessarily an alternative to the United States, but a hedge against its unreliability and the highest demonstration of countries attempting to diversify. Because even though the United States still offers to be a security guarantor, it's now been at war with Iran in what many countries have been anticipating for decades, and it hasn't come out very favorably at all. Therefore, other countries need to look around elsewhere. Now, what is this pact and what isn't it? So let me be precise of what has actually been signed here, because the coverage has oscillated between treating this as a transformative NATO-style alliance, or what some people have called the Islamic NATO, and dismissing it as purely symbolic. The reality is more nuanced than either, though, as always. This pact establishes a framework for collective security, intelligence sharing, defense, industrial capacity, and energy coordination. It builds on that bilateral agreement that was set between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia in the fall of last year. And it extends it to include Turkey, and it's considerably more capable, modernized, and defensive manufacturing sectors and military. But moreover, the capabilities each side brings are genuinely complementary. Firstly, Turkey has NATO's second largest military. It has world-class drone technology and battle-tested troops and equipment from its incursions into Syria only a few years ago. And its defense sector deliberately is built to reduce dependency on Western suppliers. Saudi Arabia brings financial muscle, the world's top oil exporter with the resources to fund the Pact's development and reduce dependency on American weapon systems. And then there's Pakistan. Critically, uniquely, it brings nuclear weapons. It is the only Muslim majority nuclear power on the planet, and it is now formally part of a collective deterrence arrangement. Now, whether or not that makes a big difference to some of you who wonders about Pakistan's capabilities or willingness to use nuclear, they have demonstrated their ability to dissuade foreign policy decision makers in certain actions. But the analytical caveat matters here as well. The Pact says an attack on one should be considered an attack on all. Should be. Not necessarily is. So some have put it directly that operational phrasing means the obligation is political and moral, but not automatic and military. This is therefore not Article 5. It is a framework, a signal, a direction of travel, a sort of an Article 4.8 misses the key phrasing, or perhaps the omittance of that key word. Language matters in international relations, and this is as ever a great example of that, if there could be. So what it is not, therefore, this is not a declaration of war against Iran or Israel. The signatories have been very careful not to name either as the target, but nobody in the region is under the illusion, under the impression about the context of which this has been signed. The Gulf states, countries stuck in the middle of what the region has been dominated in the past few years. Then there is something known as the three blocks, and why the binary idea that I mentioned in the opening is kind of dead. For decades, the Middle East was understood as rather binary. Saudi Arabia versus Iran, Sunni versus Shia struggles, America-backed order versus the axis of resistance, if you like. Those binaries shaped every analysis of most conflict in the region. But that binary, in the eyes of many, is now obsolete. The Middle East has effectively three blocks. The first is the Abraham Accords. Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, aligned with the United States and committed to the normalization on terms that have become increasingly difficult to sustain those since October 7th. Then there is the Iranian axis, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, those weakened by current wars but not eliminated, and still capable of projecting some degree of force across the region through relevant means, be that through the Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, or so on. But then the third is a more new significant one, this Mecca bloc, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, sitting between these two, wary of both, and explicitly hedging against the United States' unreliability. And so now bound together in this collective security framework that gives it weight that it never previously had. Quick to react, Netanyahu already warned about the emergence of what he called the Sunni axis. The irony is that his own actions here, Gaza, Lebanon, strikes on parts of the Gulf, have been more to do and create this axis than arguably some people think the Iranian pressure or the American abandonment. He's just called it out and inadvertently built it simultaneously. Now, what I think is also defining here in terms of foreign policy ambitions was for Trump to seek the expanding of the Abraham Accords. It was effectively the crowning jewel if he could get Saudi Arabia to improve, formally recognize and normalize relations with Israel in what would be the single biggest diplomatic achievement of the region. Certainly, the Saudis and the Israelis have had a de facto normalization, but it needed to be de jure, established, official. The Mecca Joint Defense Pact is not a direct rejection of that ambition, mind you. Saudi Arabia has not closed the door, but it has demonstrated publicly and formally that it is willing to take risks, diversify its security relationships, and build alternatives to Trump's America, or at least America's led order in the region. That is a signal to Washington. It says, we are not captive to your priorities. We have options. And this has been shown by China's rapprochement that it did a couple of years ago between the Saudis and the Iranians as well. Then there's another group, which I think is very important to mention here as well. The I2U2, meaning India, Israel, UAE, and the United States. They will likely become much more vocal and more active in response. The Abraham Accords bloc has a direct interest in presenting an alternative vision of regional security architecture. And so expect that grouping to deepen its coordination and its public messaging as a counterweight to what was formalized in Mecca on Friday. Two regional security architectures, competing visions, and America somehow trying to straddle both while prioritizing one. So what comes next then? And who could potentially join? Now, the three signatories have been quick to sign and state that this pact is explicitly open to new members. And the question of who joins next is the most consequential unanswered question in Middle East and geopolitics right now. Firstly, there's Egypt, who is one of the most significant candidates and the one worth watching most closely, especially given the most recent strikes a few days back. It is the largest Arab military in the world, with deep historical ties to both Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And crucially, there are already signs earlier this year of a deeper Egyptian, Turkey, Pakistani, Saudi consultation that predated Friday's signing. That's what I made my prediction on. Cairo's hesitation, though, has always been about avoiding entanglement in regional conflicts it can't control. But that calculation is shifting. Egypt's economic dependence on Gulf money and its growing unease with both Israeli expansionism, but also Iranian pressure, are pushing it towards this framework in ways that were not visible 6-12 months ago. And certainly Egypt has a history of hedging and counterbalancing, say, between the Soviets and, of course, the United States as a non-major NATO ally. Secondly, there is Qatar, who is another candidate worth dwelling on. They've been a crucial mediator, like Pakistan, in negotiations, and they're already very close to Turkey, who is a significant financial power and a deeply uncomfortable with the vulnerability it has experienced after the Israeli strikes on it last year. Qatar's historical relationships with Iran and Hamas complicate the formal alignment, and certainly Qatar's fallout with Saudi Arabia a few years ago has meant that it's in a slightly more uncontested position. But Mecca's Pact's deliberately broad framing leaves room for that normalization, restoration, improvement of ties, and certainly that seems more likely given the collective experience that the Gulf states have had given the war with Iran. Then there is a quick look at the others, namely UAE, Syria, and Jordan, who maybe in a longer time horizon could potentially join, but they face more immediate constraints, diverging interests, and certainly the UAE's case or desire to put most of its eggs in its basket with the United States, whilst falling out grossly with the Saudi Arabians over the situation in Yemen, demonstrates that it's unlikely. The real test of the Pact's trajectory is Egypt. If Cairo joins, this becomes the dominant framework for Middle Eastern security for a generation, and it could even spread further than Egypt across North Africa. Overall, as I said 3 months ago, the Middle East is undergoing a permanent shift in its balance of power. What looked like two main countries vying for regional hegemony, and then Israel there as a slightly unique case in support of the United States, has completely flipped on its head. And we have two predominant groups now vying for power in a way that could spread the tension of this far beyond just the Middle East. Certainly, if Pakistan joins, then what does that mean for India's renewed interest in the region? That's why the I2U2 is so important to watch. On Friday in Mecca, one part of this was formalized. All three of these countries representing a comparative advantage, be that the military side of Turkey, the oil and financial side of Saudi Arabia, or the nuclear deterrence and advanced engineering side for Pakistan. Now they are bound by this collective security framework that says an attack on all should be considered an attack on all of them. And that will greatly redefine how other countries who have interests, be that the Chinese or the Russians, look at this. The Middle East has different blocks, and the binary shaping, the way that we have looked at the Middle East for the best part of 50 years, is largely obsolete. And so the question of what comes next, who joins, how Israel responds, whether the Abraham Accords can survive the pressure, whether Trump changes his approach and can maintain relations with both these emerging architectures simultaneously, well, that remains very clear. But what is clear is the direction of travel. And that has been a long time since Friday coming. but certainly it's only just beginning, and it could get a lot hairier from here. But if that's of interest to you guys, then of course stay tuned to this channel. If you haven't already, then do consider subscribing. Give the video a like. It's free, but really supports the channel. And I'll see you all in the next one, the next update of something like this, as you continue to understand the big chess pieces making the moves that affect us all around the world. Speak soon.